Retomar o colóquio
Good
internacional.
afternoon. Let's resume the International Colloquium Sparks of Transformation, Paulo Freire and Raymond Williams, now in the afternoon session that is going to have as a topic Raymond Williams. Before passing the floor to Professor Alexandro, I would like to make a small correction. We had a problem in the beginning of the morning session. There was an overlapping. I was trying to follow on YouTube, and
Recording in progress.
Os agradecimentos iniciais que eu havia feito, então vou pedir licença a vocês para repeti-los rapidamente. Gostaria de agradecer, de maneira muito especial, a equipe de EAD da Faculdade de Educação, através do Leandro Barbosa, principalmente.
Teaching of the institution, represented by Leandro Barbosa, the event team, represented by Giovanna Carneiro. Both departments worked very hard for this event to happen, so I would like to thank them very well. Instituto Dialética, represented by Antoni Tayeb, and especially the interpreters who have been with us since the morning, Adriana Vieira and Natalia Lessa, that allowed us to translate the speeches, and also Vitor Rocha, that has given us the technical support during this broadcast. So we will have now in the afternoon session Professor Maria Elisa Cevasco from USP and Professor Daniel Williams from Wales. Both of them are going to make conferences that are going to be mediated by Professor Alexandro Paixão from Unicamp. He is our reference, and Raymond Williams here at the university. Professor Paixão, I pass the floor to you for you to conduct this conference in the afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Renee. It's funny you call me a reference. I'm not a reference at all, but good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Let's continue the celebrations of the centennial. In the morning, we celebrated the centennial of Professor Paulo Freire, and now we are going to carry out the conferences in honor of Professor Raymond Williams. We have Professor Maria Elisa Cevasco and Professor Daniel Williams. I'm just going to make a brief comment before I pass the floor to Professor Williams, who is going to make his presentation, and then to Professor Maria Elisa Cevasco. Continuing the celebrations of the centennial of our authors in their sparks of transformation, we're going to start the celebrations of the centennial of Raymond Williams, who was an adult educator, as Paulo Freire, university professor, social critic, sociologist from Wales, that would turn this year 100 years old. We're going to celebrate Williams due to several reasons, as we're going to listen by our distinguished conferencists. But before I pass the floor to them, I would like to say that celebrating them today in the 21st century is decisive because of the democratic cultures that are happening in Brazil and several places in the world. Williams taught us through his theory and practice to handle critics, to think about the contemporary world represented by the massive society, social culture, and the banalization of democracy. Celebrating him today is renewing this critical thinking to fight against this human crisis with different emphasis and perspectives. But Williams didn't treat only the crisis. He also discussed the resources of hope. After all, he believed that a good measure for a future was in reaching an understanding of what were the seedlings of life and the seedlings of death of each time in history. If this is a moment of crisis, the invitation of Williams is trying to understand the crisis to be able to act. Thinking about this, we invited two distinguished scholars of Raymond Williams, two important international references to discuss the Wales authors with us here at our dear Faculty of Education. To start, I would like to pass the floor to Professor Daniel Williams, but before I would like to introduce him. Professor Daniel Williams is a professor of English literature at the University of Swansea at Yale. He's a member of Learned Society of Yale's, an elected member of Welsh Academy. He's a director of the Center Richard Burton for the Study of Yale's at the University of Swansea. He published several articles and chapters of books in the world. Among them, we highlight the classic Raymond Williams, Who Speaks for Wales? Nation, Culture, and Identity. Professor Daniel Williams, it's a pleasure to have you here with us again at the Faculty of Education of UNICAMP. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Alexandro, for that warm welcome and your powerful words. It's an honor to be here with you all. Let me just sort out my screen so that I can share my PowerPoint. I should say boa tarde first. I'm not sure the pronunciation is quite right. I'm always aware in a scenario like this that it's a shame that I don't speak Portuguese, but that is also an opportunity for me to thank the excellent translators who helped me through this morning. I am, of course, also speaking in my second language, so that's my defense, if you like. And of course, in Wales, we do use the translation facility on Zoom quite frequently. So a bilingual type event is not completely new to me in that sense. It strikes me that there are two primary ways of remembering Raymond Williams, perhaps this year in his centenary year, and perhaps these two ways are also true for a figure such as Paulo Freire as well. On the one hand, there's an attempt at reconstituting what he said in relation to his original and intended audience. Our understanding of Raymond Williams has been greatly enhanced by those, such as perhaps my colleague Di Smith, Williams's biographer, who have placed Raymond Williams within his time, reconstructing the cultural, historical, and institutional contexts in which he lived, worked, and wrote. On the other hand, there's an approach that seeks to perhaps explore those aspects of Raymond Williams' writings that relate to us now. And this approach often entails looking for something implied or something implicit, a possible tendency in the writing that might be repressed in his text, and that can now be brought to life, perhaps, in new contexts. Stefan Collini notes in a recent article, and I hope you can see the slides. Let me know if you can't. Please interrupt if I break out or if you lose connection. Stefan Collini says in a piece that's about to, or if it hasn't already come out in the TLS, the appeal of some thinkers' work can die with their authors as the contexts that had briefly accorded them prominence disappear and their writings come to seem dated. Those whose work continues to have a vigorous posthumous life tend to be those who make available concepts and arguments whose fruitfulness transcends the issues and settings out of which they were initially developed. And in the years immediately after his death, it seemed that Raymond Williams was perhaps going to fall into the first group, as several critiques pointed to major contemporary themes that Williams was held to have neglected or not to have anticipated. But in the last couple of decades, it's become clearer that he belongs to the second group, as new generations continue to mine his work for usable ideas. One of those areas that Williams is said to have neglected in his work revolve around issues of race and ethnicity. In my collection of Raymond Williams's writings on Wales, Who Speaks for Wales, I made the case that those accusing Williams of being blind to questions of identity tended to ignore his Welsh upbringing and formation. This, I argued in the introduction back in 2003, was particularly the case when it came to attacks such as that mounted by Paul Gilroy, that Williams's view of Britishness and of British identity was essentially white and profoundly discriminatory. That's Paul Gilroy's seminal "There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack," which was a racist taunt, but turned on its head by Gilroy to explore some of the racist assumptions that he felt informed British cultural criticism. There's a quote here by Gilroy where he summarizes his view of Williams, quite apart from Williams's apparent endorsement of the presuppositions of the new racism. The strategic silences in his work contribute directly to its strength and resilience. So Gilroy accuses Williams really of harboring the same attitude towards Englishness and the same fear of immigration as that of the English far right, as embodied in figures in British politics such as Enoch Powell, who was a conservative member of Parliament who delivered a famous racist speech in 1968. Now, these issues have come back, I think, into focus in our period, in the period of Black Lives Matter. So the title of my paper today was Reading Raymond Williams in the Age of Black Lives Matter. And perhaps we could say also Reading Raymond Williams in the Age of Bolsonaro, as was being evoked this morning. A moment perhaps that brings the erasures, blindnesses, but also the relevance and the power of Raymond Williams's writings into focus. Paul Gilroy's harshest critique derived from two aspects of Raymond Williams's analysis of national identity in the book Towards 2000. The first was the fact that Williams based his discussion of race on a scenario in which, I quote Williams, an English working man protests at the arrival and presence of foreigners or aliens, and then goes on to specify them as blacks. That's Williams's description of the process. And on this evidence, Gilroy says that Williams does not seem to recognize black as anything other than a subordinate moment in an ideology of racial supremacy. That is what Gilroy is saying, that in Raymond Williams's writings, blackness is othered as not British, as not English, within the context of a normalized white Britishness and Englishness. The second aspect of Williams's analysis that Gilroy found troubling was that Williams's focus was not actually on the view of the English working man. He wasn't offering a critique of working class racial attitudes, but his focus was rather on the ideology of the standard liberal reply to that working man's protestations, and that reply being, they are as British as you are. So, the working man identifies the other as black in inverted commas. The liberal responds by saying, well, they are as British as you are. We are as British as each other, no matter where we're from. Now that kind of line, according to Williams, and I quote, reduces social identity to formal legal definitions at the level of the state, and ignores the power and legitimacy of people's communal identities. That's Williams. So for Paul Gilroy, this focus on the reply amounted to a refusal on Williams's part to examine the concept of racism at all. And even worse, really, that Williams was undermining the kind of legal definitions required for a tolerant society. as you can see, I think from what I'm saying, there's some legitimacy to Gilroy's argument, at least given the quotations that I've just offered, which are the quotations that he uses. Now, my main counter to Gilroy's accusations of racism was to note that Raymond Williams was not endorsing or defending the words of the English working man. Williams does not, as Gilroy accuses him of, denying the indispensability of citizenship rights for immigrants. For Raymond Williams states explicitly, a few lines earlier, that a merely legal definition of what it is to be British is necessary and important, correctly asserting the need for equality and protection within the law. So Williams is unequivocally supporting legal forms of acculturation and citizenship. Furthermore, and this is a point I think I made in Brazil a few years ago in a wonderful conference that Alexandro organized, Williams located what he calls the real grounds of hope in the experience of the Welsh mining valleys, into which in the 19th century there was massive and diverse immigration, but in which after 2 generations, and this is Williams, the quotation is there, I'm selecting from it, but after 2 generations, there were some of the most remarkably solid and mutually loyal communities of which we have record. So, I mean, the history of the industrialization of South Wales is the story of a nation, or if you prefer, the western peninsulas of the British Isles that become industrialized because of coal, with the population increasing from less than 500,000 in 1800 to over 2.5 million by the turn of the 20th century. So you have this process of revolution, really, but in the process of which you see the emergence of a new kind of Welsh identity emerging. And that, for Williams, is where he sees the real ground of hope. So I would still want to emphasize that Williams was never opposed to immigration, and that to compare his thought with that of the far right in terms of immigration, or with a figure such as Enoch Powell, or Bolsonaro, if you like, that to do that is actually misleading. It's to deliberately misunderstand and to misread his work. But I would like now to supplement that argument with an analysis of the ways in which what Williams described as the remarkably solid and mutually loyal communities of which we have record in South Wales were partially created through a process of racialization, by which a white working class did define itself against a racial other. Though there were historical and contemporary black communities in South Wales, especially in Butetown and the Cardiff Docklands, where a major race riot took place in 1919. Immigration into South Wales primarily involved white ethnic groups, white Europeans, mainly English, but also Irish, Scottish, but also Spanish, Italians, Jewish people, and so forth. And this, I think, does in some ways affect Williams's analysis of race. So this is something I didn't really engage with in 2003, but I think this moment brings these issues to bear. In his discussion of race and the making of the American working class, David Rudiger registers the crucial contribution made by the New Labour historians of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in showing the extent to which workers, even in periods of economic depression or political oppression, were historical actors who made their own political choices, created their own cultural forms. He notes, however, a hesitancy on the part of historians of the left to explore working class whiteness and white supremacy as creations in part of the white working class itself, not just something imposed by a dominant ideology from above, but in some ways inherent to the process of creating a class consciousness. Now, Roediger's work emerges from the ethnically and racially diverse communities of industrial America. But it is worth keeping in mind his observation that even in an all-white town, race was never absent when analyzing the constitution of identities in industrial, we might call it, indeed, the sociologist Alfred Zimmern did in the 1920s, in industrial American Wales. Zimmern described South Wales as American Wales. The Welsh labour historians on whom Raymond Williams mainly drew for his understanding of Welsh history, notably Gwyn Alf Williams and Di Smith, who I've already mentioned, these historians rejected views of working class societies as unthinking victims of political and cultural hegemonies. Like their American equivalents in the 70s, they were emphasizing the agency of working class communities. Yet, as the Wales-based African-American ethnographer Glenn Jordan has noted, the cultural forms and political values that emerged from those societies were not always progressively subversive. Glenn Jordan says this: South Wales miners and mining communities are famous for their socialist traditions and internationalism, including the virtual hero worship of Paul Robeson. But there is another long-established tradition in the South Wales valleys, the working class community as a breeding ground for racism. Now, part of the context for this is that dominant forms of Welshness evolved and were defined in the Victorian era, in the period of mass immigration, in relation to an imperial discourse of blackness. Industrial South Wales is booming at the time that the British Empire is expanding, and these things are inevitably related. Wales plays an ambiguous role here in that the Welsh were contributing to the imperial venture, both in terms of the money being raised through coal in South Wales, but also through actual people going out to be imperialists, finding occupational opportunities in the expanding empire. But also the Welsh were part of an assimilationist process of empire itself. The desire, for instance, to eradicate the Welsh language as a hindrance to the internal homogeneity or the structure of the British state. The government's report on the state of education in Wales, for instance, it's a famous report of 1847 in Welsh history. That report described Welsh as the language of slavery. That's the language of the report itself, a language that keeps the Welsh, according to the commissioners who wrote the report, keep the Welsh under the hatches. I think an image from the slave ship. And the Welshman described as living in an underworld of his own. An underworld of his own. As the march of society goes completely over his head. So the goal of the report was the assimilation of the Welsh, essentially, into English norms. And they had a lot to say about Welsh nonconformist religion as a barrier to assimilation, and the language in particular, as I've emphasized. Linguistic and religious deviancy from Anglophone norms were clothed in a language of slavery and of servitude. Now, significant sectors of the Welsh middle class, the Welsh bourgeoisie in the Victorian era, responded to these attacks by trying to prove that they were British citizens. They emphasized, in a sense, their whiteness against this discourse of blackness. They aimed to remodel themselves and their people as practical, businesslike, English-speaking Britons. Indeed, Gwyn, white, is one of the keywords of the Welsh ideology of social uplift in the Victorian era. I didn't include this in what I passed on to the interpreter, so I apologize, but it might be worth hearing some Welsh. You'll see the translation in English. This is the kind of verse, fairly awful stuff really, produced in the late Victorian era, emphasizing the docility, but also the whiteness of Wales. And while the whiteness draws on biblical imagery, is not directly racial in intent, I think in the context of empire and the discourse around race that I've just quickly mapped out, I don't think the racial element is completely missing either. Cymru lan, Cymru lonydd, Cymru wen, Cymru annwyl beunydd. Cymru being the Welsh word for Wales. So you can see sort of the patriotic repetition. Cymru deg, Cymer y dydd, gwlad y gan, gwyl dy gynydd. The form is the englyn, a traditional form of Welsh verse that involves the echoing of certain consonants on particular beats of the line. You can kind of hear the music of it, I hope. So this is the construction of a kind of white Wales in the face of a discourse of empire. In the United States, this is the story really of how the Irish became white, right? Facing considerably more sort of racial discrimination than the Welsh, but the process I think is somewhat similar as explored by Noel Ignatieff in the book on the slide. Or how Breton peasants and the Basques became Francophone Frenchmen to adopt Eugene Weber's formulation. I don't know, some of you might be familiar with Weber's work on from peasants into Frenchmen. One of the forms this process took in South Wales, which perhaps is somewhat surprising, is that blackface minstrelsy was very popular in the industrial areas. It's depicted colourfully by Jack Jones and Gwyn Jones in the industrial novels of the 1930s, which are analysed by Raymond Williams in a series of seminal lectures. During the long lockout of 1926, some of you might be familiar with the general strike and lockout of 1926. That forms the background, of course, to a lot of the childhood memories in Raymond Williams's border country. The mining communities of that time found expression in what they called jazz and gazooka bands, such as the Seven Sisters Black Natives, the Carolina Coons, and the Black-Faced Graig Miners. And pictures of industrial South Wales in the 1930s will often involve groups like this, working class communities blackening their faces for entertainment purposes. So South Wales, in a way, exemplifies Susan Gruber's observation that race-changing conventions enabled artists from many traditions to relate nuanced comparative stories about various modes and gradations of othering. That is, it wasn't limited to the United States or even to racially diverse communities. Tiffany Willoughby Herard notes that the process of social uplift for poor whites in many contexts involved a process of racial decontamination. That's Willoughby Herard's terms, white decontamination. And having been defined or associated with blackness in Victorian discourses of class and empire, progress for white minorities, for white working class minorities in particular perhaps, was measured by their distance from a black other. What W.E.B. Du Bois described as the wages of whiteness allowed an assimilationist route for white ethnic groups that was never available to their black contemporaries. The rise of white ethnics up the social hierarchy in the United States was, in Walter Ben Michael's terms, less an effect of the triumph over racism than it was an effect of the triumph of racism. That is, the rise of the Irish as they became white was actually a result of racism, not of anti-racism, because part of that process was defining the Irish as white and therefore reinforcing the idea of black otherness. And blackface minstrelsy, I think, can be read as an embodiment of this dynamic in popular culture in the United States, and albeit in a muted form in Wales as well. I'll be coming around to Raymond Williams because I do think that this is a history that he's drawing on in some ways. Having said all that, when the African-American novelist Richard Wright deployed the term the white Negro in his 1957 work Pagan Spain, he was not describing a process of passing as white, but was rather emphasizing the impurity of a Spanish history that included pagan, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, African, and Moorish strands. And there's an element of Wright's definition of the term that's interesting, I think. If a discourse of increasing whiteness reflected the racial logic of assimilation, that is, assimilation is becoming white, well then in the 20th century, minority nationalists in Europe and anti-assimilationist white subcultures in the United States followed Wright's example in adopting the mask of blackness as a means of differentiating themselves from mainstream norms. So as forms of separatist nationalism developed on the peripheries of the French and British states, in the Basque Country, in Brittany, in Scotland, in Wales, and as various American subcultures would begin to question the ideology of uplift undergirding American assimilationism, reaffirming their ethnic identities, white minorities would begin to reappropriate the blackness, in inverted commas, that they had been so desperate to reject a generation earlier. Raymond Williams would have been familiar with Norman Mailer's famous essay, problematic essay on the white Negro, which both exemplified and analyzed this use of blackness as a marker of difference by the beat poets and hipsters of the 1950s. For he reviewed an anthology of articles for the journal Dissent, in which it was republished. Williams was never to appropriate the black mask in this primitivist manner, but he did note in the review of Ned Thomas's The Welsh Extremist, which is the paperback edition. This is a text of the early 1970s, which could go on the slide we saw earlier today, amongst pieces by Freire and Althusser and so forth. This is the little red book of the Welsh language movement. And The Welsh Extremist was supposed to be something of a shocking title, you know, given Cymru Lan, Cymru Lonydd, white and docile Wales, how could you possibly have such a thing as a Welsh extremist? And The Guardian, the English left paper, gave this book to Raymond Williams to review. And one of the conclusions he came to is this: it seems to be true that in late capitalist societies, some of the most powerful campaigns begin from specific, unabsorbed, and therefore necessarily marginal experiences and situations. Black power in the United States, civil rights in Ulster, the language in Wales, are experiences comparable in this respect to the student movement and to women's liberation. So I think the implication of Raymond Williams's Welsh essays, in a way, is that we need to make a distinction between the assimilationist fear of blackness, characteristic of white minority discourses of uplift into British and American norms, and the minority nationalists' embrace of blackness, metaphorically, and desire to make broader comparisons with other anti-colonial movements as a strategy to counter and to resist assimilation. So we have, on the one hand, the assimilationists' wish to decontaminate and the minority nationalists' wish to associate. But they're both problematic, if for different reasons. The problem with the assimilationist narrative is clear enough, right? It's based on a racial hierarchy of inferiority and superiority, a racist fear of contamination. But the adoption as well draws on strains of ahistoric and romantic identification, and functions, or can function at its worst, to ventriloquize the voices of racialized others, therefore potentially, if not wholly, denying them the power to speak for themselves. In contemporary Wales today, and I think this is true elsewhere for other kinds of minorities, the danger is particularly apparent in the use of colonialism to describe the Welsh experience, especially as Wales is today a first world nation whose industrial history is intimately tied to the economy and practice of the slave trade and empire. But it's also true that Welsh literary and intellectual history constitutes one of the longest documented traditions of resistance to domination and to assimilation. And Raymond Williams picks up on some of these threads, both the complexity of being involved in empire and the historical resistance to being assimilated. My saddest discovery, he said in 1977, was when I found that in myself, that most crucial form of imperialism had happened. That is to say, where parts of your mind are taken over by a system of ideas, a system of feelings which really do emanate from the power center. I suppose exactly the kind of process that Paulo Freire was attempting to undo through his pedagogy of the oppressed. And of course, today, the nature and terms of the colonial debate is transformed once we start to define Wales in multicultural terms, as a crucible of difference in its own right, as opposed to an ethnic group contributing to the British melting pot. And this is an aspect of the more sort of striking and progressive elements in Welsh thought, the rise of figures such as Charlotte Williams, who explores the legacies of her Welsh-speaking North Walian mother and Guyanese father, the artist Dennis Williams, in fact, in this book, Sugar and Slate. There's a quote there from the book regarding Robeson as a folk hero that we've woven into the mythology of Wales. Charlotte Williams responds pithily to the challenge that the existence of a range of hyphenated Welshnesses poses to the narrative of Welsh colonial oppression. She says, well, if the Welshman is a black man at heart, where does that leave the black man who is Welsh, or the Welshman who is black? And answering that question requires an engagement with the diverse histories that constitute the contemporary Welsh people, as it would, I imagine, to any minority group. But it does not necessarily entail a rejection of national identity itself. Werner Sollers has noted that the very language used to create national unity and a sense of coherence via the assimilationist melting pot, that is, that Victorian process of assimilation and decontamination, can also serve to support the ethnogenesis of regional and ethnic groups that could challenge national unity. That is, minorities can resist assimilation by claiming a distinctive pot or bowl, melting pot of their own, which in political terms, I suppose, is a state of one's own, which is what we're seeing, I think, happening in Scotland at the moment. Therefore, emphasizing their own internal diversity and ability to integrate others. Raymond Williams never presented his arguments in the terms of contemporary multicultural debates, but his emphasis in his essays on Wales is consistently on the internal diversity of the nation and of the people. If Wales, as Williams notes, tends to be viewed as unusually singular from an English perspective, he reverses that gaze in his first novel, Border Country, a novel of 1960, where it is on the Welsh side of the border that identities become unstable, that variousness and openness replace an Englishness that is depicted in terms of its reserve and insularity. The least known fact by others about contemporary Welsh culture and politics, notes Raymond Williams, is that there are harsh and persistent quarrels within a dimension that is seen from outside as unusually singular. Wales, in this respect, illustrates his broader argument that one place is as real and as potentially interesting as another. Only metropolitan centralization and cultural imperialism would have it otherwise. Again, I think a sentence modulated slightly could have been spoken by Paulo Freire. So it's in relation, I think, to this context and to this argument that we should address Raymond Williams's shift of focus in the culture of nations criticized by Gilroy from the ideology informing the English working man's protests at the arrival and presence of, in inverted commas, foreigners or aliens, to the ideology of the standard liberal reply that they are as British as you are. Because Williams is not turning to the ideology of the standard liberal reply in order to ask how long is long enough to become a genuine Brit, which is what Paul Gilroy alleges. That is, the argument is that in challenging this idea, they are as British as you are, Williams is kind of saying that there's a real Britishness that new arrivals cannot claim. But that's not what he's saying at all, because Williams does not identify as British himself. And that's what Gilroy ignores. And Williams's question is not informed by a discomfort when faced by those who are not settled, not truly English, not part of the nation, as Henry Louis Gates has suggested. Henry Louis Gates pretty much repeats Gilroy's argument verbatim in his book, Cultural Criticism and the Black Atlantic. It's only by ignoring Raymond Williams's self-defined Welsh European identity that such readings become possible, that he can be read as trying to establish a white Britishness against contemporary forms of multiculturalism. And indeed, what Gilroy and Gates ignore in their histories of cultural studies in England, and it's England is the term they use primarily, is that the figure who they both suggest begin that tradition, that Raymond Williams, the guy who creates American studies according to many of these narratives, was a member of a minority himself. Not a member of a racial minority, but nevertheless a member of a minoritized people within the British state. And this is not a trivial matter, or at least I don't think it's a trivial matter, because the erasure of Williams's Welsh identity leads to misleading accounts of his work and his intent. Williams's intention in turning to the ideology of the reply, they are as English, they are as British as you are, is to reject the kind of ahistorical, assimilationist conception of Britishness that Gilroy actually critiques himself a few pages later when he discusses a Tory election poster of 1983, which said that Labour says he's black, Tories say he's British, next to the figure of a British citizen of Afro-Caribbean background. Blacks are being invited, states Gilroy, in replying to that poster, to forsake all that marks them out as culturally distinct before real Britishness can be guaranteed. And that's the problem with assimilation. It asks people to reject everything that they have been, and now they're merely British. And this is precisely Raymond Williams's point. To focus on the ideology of the standard liberal reply is to expose the ways in which Britishness is rendered empty and contentless, in order that it can then function as the universal space where difference can be rendered irrelevant and cultural particularism can be transcended. The ideal within the state of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, is to create an assimilated British subject. And that's what Raymond Williams is critiquing. Slavoj Žižek, who notes that when some procedure is denounced as ideological, you can be sure that its inversion is no less ideological, would, I think, approve of Williams's turn to the standard liberal reply, because it's in keeping with the Slovenian's argument regarding the self-denial of white identity in contemporary arguments around decolonization. This is Žižek. And this is why white liberals so gladly indulge in self-flagellation. The true aim of their activity is not really to help the others, but the lustgewinn brought about by their self-accusations, the feeling of their own moral superiority over others. The problem with the self-denial of white identity is not that it goes too far, but that it does not go far enough. While its enunciated content seems radical, its position of enunciation remains that of a privileged universality. So what he's claiming in a way is that to decolonize, or the implications of what Žižek is saying, is that to decolonize Britishness, we need not only to follow people like Edward Said, Gauri Viswanathan, Paul Gilroy, and others in demystifying the myth of cultural homogeneity, cohesion, insularity, that discourse that equates Britishness with Englishness of the home counties, as Raymond Williams notes, by making empire and its legacies central to national history. You know, it's not just that process of deconstructing homogeneous notions of Britishness, but it also requires us to demystify forms of British universalism. Jed Esty usefully identifies the reasons for why this pincer movement, if you like, this argument from two directions is required. Because in colonial modernity, Englishness, and I think we can say Englishness / Britishness, really, represented both an insular wellspring of distinctive values and an almost blank Arnoldian metacultural capacity to absorb and govern the cultures of its periphery. The English difference was then both a cultural essence and an essential culturelessness. So there's an idea of English values to which you're meant to assimilate, but that assimilation is into sort of this universal realm that lies actually beyond any culture at all. Decolonization involves an insistence on the multicultural history and reality of the British against monocultural myths, and a critique of the ways in which Britishness poses as the realm of the universal. Jed Esty sees this dual process exemplified in the work of Stuart Hall, a key collaborator with Williams, of course, whose work combines multicultural and multi-ethnic studies of England that challenge monolithic myths of national identity, while also recognizing the importance of addressing, and I quote Hall, a conception of Englishness which, because it is hegemonic, does not really represent itself as ethnicity at all. So these emphases, I think, are manifest in Williams's writings on national identity. On the one hand, he's always emphasizing the diversity of lived and formed identities, either of a settled kind, if available, he says, or of a possible kind, where dislocation and relocation require a new formation. So there's always the possibility of a new formation. He's never arguing against immigration or essentialized notion of identity that's closed to others. He is interested in the ways in which we create communities of political action and solidarity. And that's what he's writing about. And he's also always keen to reject what he calls the alienated superficialities of the nation, on the other hand. It's the internal diversity and then the superficiality of the universal. Indeed, the advantage of a minority nationalist position for Williams in the context of Wales is that it allows for an insight and emphasis on the artificialities of the settled common sense nation state, allowing the critic to shoot them to pieces from history and from social theory, as Williams says. Williams endorses Jean-Paul Sartre's point when writing about the Basques, that we're dealing with an entirely different kind of nationalism when it is a case of the marginal or absorbed or oppressed nationality, the sense of difference from some particular dominant large nation state, or of course, empire. The question then, I suppose, that follows on from that arises, perhaps especially thinking about Scotland and Catalonia in Europe today, or at least Catalonia is still in Europe, Scotland isn't, but if the SNP lead to independence, they might well rejoin Europe. So there's the European dimension to this. The question that arises is what happens if the nationalist project succeeds and subordination comes to an end in the form of an independent political state? Is the minority then doomed to adopt the discourses of sameness and assimilation and intolerance characteristic of those other coercive universalisms of the great nation states that deny the particular differences of others? And this question leads us to a final step in the argument. The standard liberal reply that they are as British as you are expresses a desire that the majority should be tolerant enough to allow minorities to transcend their particularities in embracing a capacious, open, democratic Britishness. But what this seemingly tolerant gesture ignores or forecloses or makes impossible is the possibility of a distinctive universalism rooted in the experience of minorities. A Welsh or a Black or a Jewish universalism, say. The liberal assimilationist reply rightly rejects racist intolerance, but hides a fear that minorities may not wish to give up their particularities, may not wish to assimilate into a predefined Britishness, but might rather want to create a distinctive universalism of their own. This form of the universal would not require the erasure of its particularism by the Black or Jewish or Welsh language community. It would require an embrace of what Zizek describes as the determinate negation, which bears the mark of what it negates. Thus, while the standard liberal reply to the particularism of a movement such as Black Lives Matter would be to emphasize that all lives matter, a variant, if you like, of they are as British as you are in Williams's scenario. A more far-reaching response would acknowledge that while this principle on the slide is true in today's concrete constellation, the violence to which Blacks are exposed is not just a neutral case of social violence, but its privileged exemplary case. To reduce it to a particular case of violence means to ignore the true nature of violence in our society. This is the Hegelian concrete universality. We can formulate the universal dimension only if we focus on a particular case which exemplifies it. And this, I think, is very close to what Raymond Williams meant when he spoke of militant particularism and real universalities. In this crucial dimension of his thought, the logic of movements based on class, ethnicity, and nation are structurally related. Writing in 1981 of the unique and extraordinary character of working class self-organization, Williams noted, "It has tried to connect particular struggles to a general struggle in one quite special way. It has set out as a movement to make real what is at first sight the extraordinary claim that defense and advancement of certain particular interests, properly brought together, are in fact the general interest." The movement of this argument, from the particular to the general, is repeated in the attempt at seeking a response to the intolerable confusion, as Williams calls it, regarding nationhood and identity. Little, notes Williams, is to be gained from the familiar jump to this or that universality. But this does not entail a rejection of the universal. And this last lengthy quote is the last slide. And I think it's kind of key to understanding Williams today. The real universalities, he says, large forms which do succeed in prevailing over more local forms, are not to be found in intellectual systems, but in actual and organized relationships which achieve over the relevant areas effective power. This is the way to look at the urgent modern problem of the nation. It is ineffective and even trivial to come back from a demonstration of the universality of the human species and expect people from that fact alone to reorganize their lives by treating all their immediate and actual groupings and relationships as secondary. For the species meaning and the valuation of human life which it carries is in practice only realized, indeed perhaps in theory only realizable, through significant relationships in which other human beings are present. No abstraction on its own will carry this most specific of all senses. To extend it and to generalize it in sufficiently practical ways involves the making of new relationships, which are in significant continuity and not in contradiction with the more limited relationships through which people do and must live. So for the solidarities, coming to a conclusion, for the solidarities forged in a particular struggle to become meaningfully practical, it requires them to be extended and generalized into a new form of society. For Williams, political engagement needs to be grounded in a militant particularism that exemplifies a broader, universal truth. The civil rights and Black Lives Matter movements in the United States draw on the specificity of the African-American experience to articulate a program of universal justice. The most far-seeing strains of the feminist and ecological movements project their particularisms forward into wide-ranging reconstructions of society with the aim of benefiting all. This process, where the particular crisis of a community under stress, under attack, becomes extended into a political movement that addresses the total relations of a society, as identified by Raymond Williams as also being one of, and I quote, the most significant parts of the history of Wales. So in his work, the envisaged federation of movements, mobilizing particular energies for universal ends, in his work, that sort of rainbow coalition of the left includes what he calls radical nationalist forces of the Irish or Scots or Welsh or Breton or Basque. Williams noted that challenging personally and publicly and from wherever we are, the immense imperatives, which are not only flattening but preventing the realities of identity and culture, is a cause better than national and more than international, for in its varying forms, it is a very general human and social movement. And on that point, I'll end. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. Excellent presentation. Very original presentation with very interesting questions for us to reflect upon. Nationalism and the social movements. We're going to talk about this later. I'm going to continue passing the floor to Professor Maria Elisa Cevasco. And since we're going to have some time, we can gather some questions from the audience on YouTube after Maria Elisa's speech. Okay? I'm going to introduce Professor Maria Elisa now.
Maria Elisa já está ali. Ok, então vamos lá.
There she is. Well, once again, Professor Maria Elisa Cevasco, it's a pleasure to have you with us once again. Our last meeting was a while ago, and now we are repeating here for the centennial. So I'm very, very happy to be meeting you once again. You are quite well known, but it's important to introduce you once again. Professor Maria Elisa Cevasco has a doctorate in literature by the University of São Paulo. She is an associate professor in cultural subjects and English literature at USP. She has published several papers and chapters in books in Brazil and abroad, among which are the Para Ler. And you have the floor, Professor Maria Elisa. Thank you very much, Alexandro. I'm very happy to be here once again with the same group from last colloquium at Unicamp, which is my second home, so to speak, because I go often to this university and we have excellent research interactions as well as publications. And I'm going to begin after these thanks by saying that I started by being very happy and excited with this panel because Alexandro started by mentioning one of the most interesting sentences from Raymond Williams, which is in the Cultural Society, which is the idea that there are ideas and modes of life with the seed of life and other ideas with the seeds of a general death, and our capacity to distinguish and name them may be literally the measure of our world. In a world such as ours, in which the seeds of death are wherever we look, I was happy to be able to begin by hearing a sentence reminding me of this good thing. Do you have ideas with the seeds of life? Which are the ones that bring us together here and make us be seated in front of a computer or an iPhone, trying to think better about or rethink for the better our situation. I really liked Daniel's speech. Is it being translated? Yes. I really liked Daniel's speech when he brings Raymond Williams to the present and sets him as a speaker of these times and of the pressing matters of the identities that take so much room in our thought, and how Daniel brings down the criticism from Gilroy, who visited Brazil, and then Gates as well. And I thought it was, he refuted them quite well. For us who want to think about these issues of identity, we must do is just as clearly as Daniel said, and we should practice an active particularism. Having said that, I will begin my speech. I propose to Alexandro at the beginning of the event, and it may sound a little demagogic, but I wanted to do gestured in the Freire and Williams sense. I wanted to listen, so I will try to reduce my presentation so that there is time to hear questions from those who are watching us on YouTube and colleagues who are present here with us. So I will tell you very quickly that when I was preparing my speech, I wondered, okay, what direction shall I choose? And of course, one of those, since we are celebrating William's centennial, is talking about race. So what can we do with William's thought today? And Williams, as we all know, thinker of change, the thinker of revolution, of transformation, and we live in times of conformity, of always having the same thing. These are sad times where, in the words of Marxist thinker Frederick Jameson, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, which is what determines our way of life that bothers us so much. But I would like to share with you a story, and as a researcher of Williams, I don't know if you have heard of it. I heard of it just a while ago. It will come out in a dossier that we are organizing for a Marxist magazine, and Alexandro contributes to this magazine, and Francis Mulhern, Daniel knows him. He's a scholar who knew Williams, and he was part of the team that interviewed Williams. And the story told by Francis is the following one. And Raymond Williams liked to tell that story. He said, we are in an institution. The members are reunited to examine the situation, reach a judgment, and determine a ruling. Maybe it's an academic discussion, but it could be a BBC meeting or a debate in Parliament. You have proposals, comments, suggestions, counter-proposals, and in the rooms you hear reasonable, constructive speeches. But then you hear a new voice, maybe a disconcerting voice, but a voice that is not desired. You can't say that, says an authority to this voice, because what was said was not merely false. Maybe it wasn't even false, but it was fundamentally out of context, out of order. And it's quite simple. Whatever the words you choose to emphasize it, you cannot say that. And now back to work. But no, even before reasonable people start shaking and nodding their heads, you hear once again the same voice that try to silence. And it says, why not? But this is what I came to say. Why can't I say that? This is what I came to say. So I imagined that organizing this speech, I thought, what could I say that Williams would have to say? There is a collection of his thoughts, and it's called What I Came to Say. It's so much nicer in English than in Portuguese. It sounds so much better, o que eu vim para dizer. And I have thought for hours how I would translate that's what I came to say. I don't know if my translation was good. Anyway, I was thinking what I could tell you. What did William come to say that bothers us so much? Why are so many people bothered by him and want to tell him, you can't say that? And he will reply, I came to say that. So I will organize my speech, and I'll try to finish on time. I thought about organizing this report of why, because why Williams bothers so many people, and base it on 3 pillars. And I will try to develop them fast. The first pillar or axis is which we can call an invention of categories. He invented new categories to talk about the central issues of culture and society. And it's called keywords, where he says that the meaning of words is always the result of a discursive fight. And when I talked about that, none of my students understood what I meant. And nowadays, we are in the midst of discursive fights, or whenever we open WhatsApp. So what he means is because he disputes a narrative on the issue of words. He says it's not a matter of dictionary, it's the way you live. The way you think is the way you live. This is very important. So the central word is the word culture. Williams took the word culture from the hand of conservatives who proclaimed an exclusive view, an elitist view of culture. He took that word from them. It was a hegemonic view on culture, and still is. It is a very usual vision nowadays. We're talking about 1958, and many people still think that culture is for what you can see in, let's say, posh meetings or posh music rooms. Or Williams took that concept away, that culture of concept away from the hands of a privileged minority that fought for everything that was culture, and he introduced the idea of culture as a way of life. And he introduced a democratic, inclusive concept of culture. And in this essay where he introduces this idea, and it clashes with the hegemony of the society in which he worked, because this elitist view was the predominant one. It was Cambridge. Anyway, he worked at Cambridge University. He published that paper clashing with the hegemonic view on culture. And he said, culture is ordinary, which is difficult to translate into Portuguese, because not for those who have their degrees in English, but the problem is in English, ordinary is opposed to extraordinary. It's exactly the opposite, which they said the culture was extraordinary. And why don't you say it's common in Portuguese, comum? But what we have to do is try to fight for a common culture. So I will use the word ordinary in Portuguese, ordinário, so that you don't think I'm speaking English or trying to be posh, but this is the meaning I want you to see. This is a culture for everyone. Culture belongs to everyone, and it expresses itself in different ways. Williams said that main work of literature is just an expression, of culture as the work of a union. So he presents a concept of culture that is democratic and all-inclusive. And just because of that, he bothered a number of people, keeps on bothering them, by the way, today. And the second thing he did was to found a new theoretical position, which he called cultural materialism. And doing this, he displeased imperialists as well as Marxists, orthodox Marxists, because he proposed a view of the interaction between social processes and creative processes that are the basis of a Marxist criticism, how this interaction takes place. And he proposed an idea that was different and much more dynamic. He caught that well-known Marxist idea of the basis that determines the superstructure that you always heard of, and that costs Marxism a constant stream of accusations of reductionism, that we are people who understand nothing about art. And what he did is Raymond Williams changed that. He reversed the notion and said, actually, this idea is for us to understand that you cannot understand an artistic project or an intellectual project or a culture, in other words, if you do not understand the social context from which this culture emerged, the project and the recreation, the art and society are the expression of the same thing, the same energy. So our art and our life are only expressions, different expressions of the same values and meanings that determine our life. So effectively, with this theoretical assumption and with this theoretical position, what did Williams do? He gave cultural criticism an importance that it didn't have. Cultural criticism in the hands of idealistic, usual critics was a criticism of evaluation, of giving gold stars to things. How many likes or how many gold stars does this book have? I'm the one who gives the likes or the stars. And Williams removes this function from this aspect of evaluation, whether something is good or not, has likes or doesn't have likes or gold stars. And I will once again mention a scholar, this time a Brazilian one, who resembles Williams, who is Notório Cândido, who said, and he said that from novels, and I say that from culture criticism from the standpoint of materialism. It is a discovery of the social historical reality. It is something that has a huge cognitive potential, and it is through cultural criticism that we can understand the meanings and values of society and separate these ideas with the seeds of life and death that we mentioned in the beginning. So cultural materialism is something fantastic in the end. It is a way to study, it's a method, it's a manner of getting close to things that changes our practice as critics and our affects as critics. For what's the point of our work as cultural critics? And that is another differential point introduced by Williams that bothered many, many people and still bothers them today. The third axis I wanted to mention, and I do not have a watch here, but I think I still have 10 minutes. The third axis, it's what's the point of all that? What's the use of all that? How can we use that kind of thought in our society that is so utilitarian? What do we do with that? What does Raymond Williams, what's it useful for? And these ideas, these theoretical discriminations, these ways of studying serve a strategic purpose for Williams. And his purpose was to contribute to what he called the long revolution. And he reaches the conclusion that our way of life is not commendable or to be recommended, and there's no point political movements just seizing power and not changing the hearts and minds of people. The issue is having a long revolution, which is a cultural revolution. You must circulate or make flow the meanings and values that will take you to a more egalitarian life, a more socialist life. Thereby, the Williams strategic project is, and this is what I will focus on now, since we are talking within the framework of an educational school. The long revolution are education. It's true education. It's true education that will contribute to changing meanings and values. It's through education that will be able to build a capacity of understanding social forces and who they serve. And in other words, we can redefine our concept of the basis and superstructure. We can teach our students to see how the basis is organized, as Raymond Williams teaches us how to think about the process and always changing. So it's not Jameson who thinks in the beginning. He was talking about people, but that this society will never change. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Of course not. Of course not. We have to see how things will work out. So we must make our students understand the basis. We must make our students understand the production, the superstructure that unveil the true forces that are organizing society and history. And this is our work, our duty as educators. An essay that is called Culture is Ordinary, that I just mentioned, Williams makes 3 wishes. Just to conclude his essay, he says there's these 3 wishes that he asks before he concludes the essay. Please read the essay because it's truly moving. And he says, I want to live in a society where education is ordinary. Once again, the word ordinary. And he says, what is an ordinary education and not extraordinary education? And people say, no, you no longer want to teach canon things, nothing that is traditional. No, that's not the point. Ordinary education is give access to common sense of these historical senses, tradition, and bring another aspect that is fundamental, that is the capacity to change things. And he says that it's very funny when we see his second wish, more money for education. Public money for education. One of the fears people have, we're talking about the 60s. If we extend knowledge, if we extend education,
people are not going to accept what we think. If we teach our students to criticize, to counterpose the hegemony, they're going to counterpose us that are spokespeople of this hegemony. Unconsciously, we are. He says he wants funds for public education that is not scared, where everybody is able to get this education that is going to change values. People are not going to accept what we think is correct. Do you see how much this causes revolution? And the third wish is that we modify the institutions of what we call the culture of masses. We say so-called because Williams has other amazing quote, which is, there are no masses, they're just ways of considering other people masses. He says, I want public funding for the production of culture of masses. So Are you going to lose money? Television is not going to have profit? What a pity. Newspapers don't have profits. They live off of advertisement. What he says is, what I want is that we could have the capacity to search for common means to fund this culture of masses in common. This is 1958. You could imagine talking about this today in neoliberalism, but he says, and I excuse myself because I'm going to read the last paragraph of Culture is Ordinary. He says, who believes these three crazy wishes? He says, the people who believe in democracy. And who are the people who believe in democracy? Those who do not attain to what they think and to what they feel. These are the people who believe in democracy. He says the technical means for us to carry out that modification in education and funding of education and the funding of cultural masses, they are very difficult. But the biggest difficulty is accepting deep down in our minds the values on which this change depends. The ordinary people should govern. The education and culture are ordinary. There are no masses that should be saved or captured or governed, but only the big number of people in the course of their expansion, fast expansion. I'm sorry, I'm reading in English and translating on site. But in the course of their lives, confusing and high-speed lives. The work of a writer, Raymond Williams thinks everyone is a writer. The work of a writer is with individual senses and making those individual senses common. I find those senses in the expansion throughout our journey, where the necessary changes are writing themselves on earth, and where language and the words that we use change, but the voice is always the same. Thank you very much.
2:05, hein?
Woohoo, 2:05. Thank you very much, Maria Elisa. I am very emotional. I apologize to the translator.
Away, as usual, from the written text, and maybe you don't know what I talked about. But you two know exactly what I talked about. You don't have to listen to me. You know all about it. Pronto, Alexandro.
Bom, o pessoal lá no YouTube está fervendo, e é o seguinte, vamos lá, temos 3 questões.
Well, people on YouTube are effervescent now. We have 3 questions, actually 3 questions to Daniel and 2 to Maria Elisa. I'm going to ask first the questions to Daniel. Can you hear me, Daniel? Yes?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to ask the 2 questions to Maria Elisa. We have 24 minutes now. Daniel, the first question is from Hugo Yvette, and he says, how, Daniel, do you see Williams as a reference to recover the progressive meaning for the national agendas? This is a question from Hugo to you. How do you see Williams as a reference to recover the meaning of the progressive agenda? If we take into consideration some of the most recent discussions on identity and the fact that the capitalism appropriated many revolutionary agendas and neutralized them in the establishment, and I remind you here of the discussions of the Black Lives Matter case in the United States, as an example, my question is, this is a question from Carla. Do you think a possible contribution of Williams to this debate could happen through the recovery of his ideas of community in a non-capitalist society, where the idea of Welsh European could join this society? Could we join this idea with the decolonial ideas as well? Could you make an establishment? Could you make a parallel of that? Maria Elisa, we have a question from Ennio. From the observation on culture on Williams, if we remove this idea of culture from the elites, how could we reinvent the notion of tradition according to Williams? This is a question to Maria Elisa, but if Professor Williams wants to comment, he could comment as well. Let me see if I have another question here from the audience. Not so far. So you have the floor. Professor Williams, you can answer first.
Wow, okay. So let's go back to the first question then regarding Williams's role in reactivating, well, those ideas with the seeds of life in them, I suppose. Alexandro, to go back to your introduction, the sources for progressive politics, but also I think the question was asking in a way, was asking the question in the context of the term nationalism itself, if I didn't misunderstand it. Because of course, you know, in a lot of leftist thought, and I'm sure in the age of Bolsonaro in Brazil, nationalism is inevitably going to carry a kind of negative element to it. And the context of today's events, the introduction talked about Brazil's Independence Day and the potential of the right to mobilize reactionary politics around the question of the nation. You know, we know this history, right, from the history of empire and its aftermath, and the creation of great nation nationalisms. Now, one approach is to reject the whole idea of nationalism altogether, and to always see nationalism as inherently reactionary in some form. And broadly, within the British left, that's the position that is taken. So had you been in Britain during the period of the Scottish independence referendum, for instance, the London press on the whole and the metropolitan press tended to view the politics of the SNP as broadly backward and atavistic. Why are you breaking us up? And even equating that then as the history developed with the politics of UKIP and the whole Brexit argument. You know, these were two forms of nationalism that were essentially the same thing, breaking up unions for the case of some kind of xenophobic mission. Well, there's a huge problem with that, because firstly, the SNP belongs far more to the left, often challenges the Labour Party from the left, in fact, whereas UKIP and the Brexit Party belonged very much to the right, and to the right of the Tory Party. In fact, their existence helped to get Johnson elected later on. So there's a problem with equating them. And I think Raymond Williams helps a lot in unpacking that, and at least to try and present the argument that there are different kinds of nationalisms. Nationalism has been the force of oppression. It's also been the force for decolonization historically. There's an article, there's an essay in Who Speaks for Wales called Are We Becoming More Divided?, where he talks about the whole lament in metropolitan circles in the 1970s with the rise of Welsh and Scottish nationalisms becoming more divided. Whereas looking at Wales from Cambridge and moving back to Wales occasionally and engaging with Welsh intellectual debate, he argues actually Wales is becoming more united. You know, there was more debate, more discussion, particularly back and forth across the linguistic divide, which had been the major divide in Wales. So what's united and what's divided usually has something to do with power and your own interests. So I think rather than emphasizing a particular agenda, Williams is particularly good at problematizing the norms that currently exist. not least around the question of nationalism, as deployed perhaps on the left and the right alike. And that's what I think I want to emphasize. What I was trying to do in the paper then was to try and pick this up in relation to the debate between the particular and the universal, which I think is kind of central to his thought. Even this idea of culture is ordinary. The root of that idea that Maria Elisa was discussing is working class culture. It's working class culture that he wants to make ordinary. So this particular experience, in a sense, is being universalized, even in that early essay. And I think his attitude towards national identity in some ways is similar, the particular as a basis for the universal. So I think that links rather neatly with I think Carla's question regarding Welsh Europeanism within the context of decolonization. I don't think these are easily equatable. I mean, the process of decolonization is one thing. The process of Europeanization is another. But there can be no Europe without an Europe that comes to terms with the history of empire, obviously. But it's equally, the European nations involved in empire cannot just jump to some universal position as if empire had never happened, as if Europe is inevitably a progressive force in the world. What Williams would emphasize is the particularities of the histories that have formed us, and the inevitability that we have to engage with the particularities of those histories in creating broader solidarity. So I think he's always looking at the solidarities between peoples, but not as a jump away from history to some ideal of a kind of unrooted or cosmopolitan mankind, or at least a cosmopolitan mankind rooted in the particulars of human experience, which I guess is, particularly pertinent given that I'm zooming in from Wales to a conference held in Brazil during this particular juncture in history. What was the other question, Alexandro? Have I broadly addressed everything that you mentioned?
Não, foi ótimo. Daniel, era Carla.
No, that was great, but it was Carla, not Carlos. It was my bad. The interpreter's bad. I'm sorry. I told you Carlos. It was Carla.
No, I heard Carla. Yeah, no, that was my accent, not the interpreter.
Ok. Maria Elisa, com você.
I should say hi, Carla, as well.
Well, bom, oi para bastante gente, né? Eu vi que o Hugo também está aqui. Na minha tela eu não consigo ver quem está, né? Que ele também está no tal dossiê que eu mencionei, o Hugo e o Alexandre. Então, nós temos 3 dossiecistas na mesma tela. Bom, mas, enfim, a pergunta que me foi dirigida é uma pergunta muito importante, principalmente para mim, por exemplo, que dou aula de literatura, né? Também, além de dar estudos culturais, que é a disciplina que o Williams inventou, né? Não é inventar nada, gente. Ele começou por causa da educação para adultos, né? Que os carinha lá que ele dava aula não estavam satisfeitos de escutar aquilo, então ele teve que modificar o que ele dava de aula, né? E com isso surgiu uma nova disciplina, né? E a tradição...
I'm sorry, Professor Williams, I'm back. I was muted, I'm sorry. So, the question that was asked to me was very important, and I would like to say first and foremost that tradition is not unimportant. It is important because it is part of our common inheritance, but it has to be thought of selectively. We're always led to think that tradition is a piece of data of reality. This is tradition. This is the great tradition of Brazilian literature. This is the great tradition of the Brazilian educational system. And we forget that this is a construction. This is a construction that changes according to each historical moment. We are watching today, just to say that I didn't talk about the horrors, we are watching today a revival in Brazil of a very selective tradition. The tradition of family, the tradition of God, the land, and the family. What tradition are these? Where did it come from? We are in 1964 again? Did you notice that there is a construction happening right now, and we are watching a new selective tradition happening all over again? So the old tradition served certain interests. And when we give the example of the present, we can see how tradition serves specific interests and not general interests. And just to link with what Daniel said before me, when he mentioned the identity policies, we are seeing today in literature the rewriting of the literary classics to include everyone that was thrown away, that was thrown off, which not by chance were ethnicities that were submitted to a cruel hegemony that had their voices unheard in the civilized choir. So your question was very interesting about tradition, and we could put together all of those connections. During my speech, I mentioned a lot the interesting connection between social process and creative process. And right now, with your question, it's possible to see that the categories that we use to think about literature and society are deeply connected to this dispute of power and this dispute of interests. So when I talk about the tradition of Brazilian literature, it's very different than mentioning a selective tradition of Brazilian literature or French or American literature that we have to get to know and we have to question. That's it.
Deixa eu perguntar uma coisa para vocês, Maria Elisa e Daniel. A gente tem outras perguntas lá no YouTube e temos também uma pergunta aqui no nosso Zoom.
Have other questions on YouTube and on Zoom. Would you like to comment? We still have 10 minutes, yes. We still have 10 minutes. Is it okay with you as well, Daniel? Commenting on the questions and comments on YouTube. Okay, so let's go on. Here on Zoom, there was Rene, and Rene is going to ask his question, and I'm gonna check the questions on YouTube while he asks his question. Okay, so Maria Elisa and Daniel, first I'd like to thank you for your presentation and congratulate you on it. It was very interesting, and at the same time I'm very curious to see how Natalia and Adriana translated, but they must have found some way. And I'm going to ask you a question. It's something I'm curious about personally, and it's a question of someone who doesn't want to do the research. Since you are here, I'm not going to look for it. In your speech, both of you remembered Antonio Gramsci, and you used the concept of hegemony. And in Maria Elisa's speech, when you talked about cultural materialism and the need, you use an expression that I liked, that socialist ideas must flow to prepare the way for revolution. And this reminded me of Gramsci, because Gramsci saw the Soviet Revolution of 1917. Then in 1920, he saw the Italian workers seize the factories, in that period called the 2 Red Years. And there was an idea that revolution would take place in Italy as well, but the unions had taken up the the plants. They negotiated with the owners, and then fascism came around. And Gramsci, thinking about that, reached the conclusion of hegemony in this concept and interpreted that way, saying that you need work with civil society, including all institutions that work with culture and ideas to prepare the path for revolution. So many people do a wrong reading that Gramsci was making concessions to idealism. From my standpoint, he didn't. What he did was he emphasized the dialectic superstructure over basis. So Williams, are you a reader of Gramsci? Do you dialogue with Gramsci? The opposite would not be possible. Williams was 16 or 17 when Gramsci died, but maybe in the field of Marxism, maybe he was one of the references. Thank you very much. So Daniel and Maria Elisa, we have 2 questions from YouTube. And I imagine the first one, I will read the question, and this is how it goes. Recently, I read an author who said that even when she was not explicitly dialoguing with Williams, she was thinking about that, considering the cultural deployments institutionalized and specialized. How can we think or go back to thinking like Williams in social, cultural perspectives that are broader? That's a question directed to you two. And then there's another question from Iglevich. And it's for both of you again. Personally, I'm interested in the category people and nation, which are also in a crisis, either through globalization or through identities that refuse to fit into the nation. Beyond the cultural materialism compared to structuralism, that distance from William by the denial of the nation and emphasis on what brings together identities through diaspora. And she emphasizes that she's working with post-colonial times, but she doesn't want to highlight nation too much. I don't know if that comment was too obvious. Oh, you have the floor.
Who's going first?
I don't know.
Well, I don't mind going first, but I don't want to go first all the time. Maria, why don't you go?
All right, I'll go quickly then. Bom, primeiro para o René. René, ó.
First to René. Great. Gramsci and Williams were there. Williams refers to Gramsci, and I thought it was very interesting that you brought up the base and the superstructure, and he speaks about how Gramsci changed his conception, Williams' conception of the basis and of ideology, and in the place of ideology, he proposed a hegemony, because contrary to ideology, hegemony presupposes the idea of intention. There is an intention behind the whole command thing. So he prefers hegemony than ideology. It's an easier way to think. The second question that was from Julia Witzel, I would like to know how we could have the cultural fruits within the cultural context. I skip on giving classes, but I have several restrictions. I didn't know that Julia Mitchell had said that, but I loved it because I try to talk to Williams the whole time. I think about Williams the whole time, and I think about how Williams would give his classes on 2021 online to students who sometimes just say, my computer is not working because there's no Wi-Fi at home. So how would Williams proceed? He would like to be a mentor. Williams is not mentor. A revolutionary can never be a mentor, but like Mitchell, I'm always trying to talk to Williams. And on the idea of people and nation and the diaspora idea, it is a very complex question that we cannot answer in 3 minutes. So just to see if it helps somehow, the concept of nation is first and foremost a wish, a desire. The issue of nation comes from desire. You want to have a nation. And the nation, as I said today, has these two sides. It has this bad side, the positive side, but on the other side, or the flip side of the coin, we saw that in post-colonial countries, it has a desire, a wish for utopia, the desire to create, to build a community and call this community a nation. So I apologize. I don't know if I helped. I tried. Daniel, now it's up to you.
Yeah, well, that's very useful. The Gramsci question, is an interesting one. Well, Maria's already said, yes, Williams did engage with Gramsci, but there's a period where he doesn't. This is related in a way to the dissemination of European Marxism in Britain. And that really happens in the 1960s. So a lot of Gramsci and Lukács and so forth, early Adorno, they're not available to Williams when he's writing his early works. It's the new left of Perry Anderson and Tom Nain and, Maria mentioned Francis Mulhern. It's that generation who really start to bring the more kind of rigorous language of European Marxism into the British left. So Raymond Williams then is impacted by that. You know, he's interestingly different to E.P. Thompson, the historian, in this respect, because E.P. Thompson is famously resistant to that, resistant to Althusser and so forth. Raymond Williams typically is seen as is seen by E.P. Thompson as someone on his side, and is seen by Perry Anderson and the New Left Review crew as someone on his side. So that says something actually about his role as a bridge builder within British culture, which perhaps links to the question then of how might we think like Williams? Because one of the things that is very clear, at least in the Anglosphere of Twitter, I'm not quite sure how Portuguese Twitter functions, but you know, very, very strongly held positions amongst people who are just unwilling to engage in dialogue of any kind. And this happens on the left as much as between left and right. You know, the left at the moment is particularly good at tearing itself up. Williams is an interesting figure because he actually does, he not only listened to voices within the left that he doesn't agree with, but is actually pretty generous to thinkers of the right in culture and society. You know, it begins with Edmund Burke. This relationship between the particular and the universal, in a way, comes from Burke. He writes of Eliot, not in disparaging ways. He's actually redefining the selective tradition that Maria Elisa mentioned, and then deploying it, using it, placing himself within it, and the history of the British working class within that. And that changes, of course, the whole definition of culture. But I think it's perhaps today, it's his ability actually to listen to other voices and to internalize them and to deploy them for his own use, rather than just to push them away. Of course, having said that, there are other voices who we'd never want to listen to on the far right and so forth. So, you know, that it's not a free-for-all, but nevertheless, he strikes me as a very generous thinker on the left compared to the mood at the moment. And then people, nation, diaspora, well, as you said, this is a huge issue. Those who wish to reject the nation of which Gilroy is an example in my paper, often want to then encourage transnational and diasporic forms of identity instead. So the Black Atlantic is Gilroy's formation of a cultural space that is not determined by national identity or by the frames of nationhood. Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin on Jewish identity have theorized the whole concept of diaspora in ways, I think, that are very, very interesting. But there are problems with that too, it strikes me. You can't join a diaspora. I couldn't suddenly claim to be a member of the Black Atlantic or a member of the Jewish diaspora. Whereas the citizenship accrued by nationhood, potentially, if I went to live somewhere and lived up to its citizenship standards, of course, that's where the differences between nations become apparent. But nevertheless, at least in principle, you can become a citizen of a nation in a way that a diaspora doesn't allow you to. As Wales and Scotland become nations, potentially, with ideas of citizenship, this question of citizenship is an interesting one in relation to Welsh, Scottish, British identities. And there has been a debate as well about, well, what about the thousands of Welsh who live in England, even Welsh speakers in England? They're never asked if they speak Welsh in the census, for instance. We don't actually know how many Welsh speakers there are in the British Isles because it's never asked. We know how many there are in Wales. So, that question of diaspora and then the question of the Celts and the Americas and so forth. It's a problematic kind of idea because once you follow that logic, you're actually starting to define identity by ancestry again, which is precisely what the civic nationhood is meant to undo. So I think whichever end of the telescope you're looking at things, there are problems. But I don't think that pretending the problems don't exist or jumping above or beyond them is the way to deal with them, but actually to engage with the tensions. And that's what Williams does all the time, consistently, when engaging with the national question.
Excelente, Raymond. Excelente, Maria Elisa.
Yes, that was excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for your speeches, for the generosity of talking to us. There are several messages expressing their thanks and congratulating you both. And I will tell you later, but we'll have to pause now. But it's not yet over. We'll stop for 55 minutes, and then we come back at 3:30 to have a dialogue of Paulo Freire with this time with Raymond Williams as well, and it would be very interesting if you could stay with us. Once again, Maria Elisa and Daniel Williams, thank you very much, both of you, on behalf of the whole Williams Group and on behalf of the Faculty of Education. Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to René so he can wrap up. You didn't have to. I just want to reiterate our thanks to Professor Maria Elisa and Professor Daniel. Thank you very much for being here, able to repeat this encounter in other opportunities and maybe even face to face. So thank you very much. So see you soon.